Okay.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Susan Bucky. I work at JBS and MassHire downtown Boston. We are delighted to have you join us tonight. We are joined by my wonderful colleague, Wendy Gelberg, who is going to be doing an excellent job of sharing some information, critical information about resumes. But before we begin, I just want to make sure that we acknowledge all of the partners who helped make the series of events that is happening every Wednesday evening in May with us. I want to make sure to acknowledge all of the partners. So we have been working with the City of Boston's Project Opportunity team, as well as the Boston Office for Workforce Development, the Office of Returning Citizens, the Department of Public Safety, and SOAR Boston, as well as the Suffolk County Sheriff's Department. So we are really, really honored and excited to be working with them, as always, to offer a really great lineup of events today. And I did want to just take a moment to take you to our website for today's event. Could you enable me to share that screen briefly?
So I think you have to take back control. I don't know if I can do it on this end.
Okay, well, never mind. If you go to the, in the chat, that's okay. In the chat, I sent a link to a website that is the landing page for the events taking place this month, which start with tonight's why and how to create a resume event or workshop. We also, next week, Wendy will be offering interview basics as well. And then on May 18th, we have a really awesome list of resources and organizations that can support you and provide some resources to you throughout your job search, even some training programs that will be presenting on Wednesday, May 18th. And then finally, we have a community job fair on May 25th from 5 to 7. And just so you know, these events are open to everyone. They are CORI-friendly, and there are also a number of additional events that are not being hosted by us, but are being hosted by some of our partners at the Lawyers Clearinghouse. And there are some information sessions on CORI and how to seal and expunge criminal records. So we just want to point that out as well. So I'm going to disappear and pass things back to Wendy, excuse me, long day. And I just wanted to say, Wendy, thank you again for sharing your expertise. You are in the best hands possible in terms of helping you create a really great resume and addressing all of the unique circumstances that make you the awesome candidate that you are. So Wendy, thank you so much for your time, and take it away.
All righty. Thank you, Susan. All right. I'm going to share a PowerPoint. Oh, I didn't want to do it that way. Let me back up for a second. What I want to share is this, I believe. Okay. Yes. And let me go back to the beginning. All right. Sorry, this is, bear with me for 1 second while I make sure I brought up the right version of this webinar. Yep, I think I did, because it says Project Opportunity up at the top. Cool. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining me this evening. I love talking about resumes. Talking about them is much easier than writing them, but writing them we must. So let me share with you some information on how to do that. First of all, if you do encounter any technology problems, because sometimes that happens, we lose our signal or our internet link, just use the same Zoom link and get back in. This session should take roughly 90 minutes, and we will be making this presentation available to you along with some handouts, which we're going to go through during the course of the session. You can see on the screen that we've activated the subtitle feature, which you can activate if you're not seeing subtitles but want them. There's a control panel that you have that says live transcript on it. And if you just click that, it will enable the words on the screen if you prefer to have those. All right, and in the event we have any veterans in our group, we thank you for your service and want you to know that you and eligible spouses can receive priority service when you are participating in our events and activities. All right, so let's talk about resumes. What we're going to be covering this evening are the following goals. We want to be sure when you're done with our session today, you will know why a resume is even necessary. You'll be able to explain the purpose of a resume. You'll be able to name a whole bunch of different categories, at least 7, that your resume might include. The thing about resumes that's interesting is they're not all identical. They don't follow a recipe. Recipes are nice and easy because everybody has the same instructions and we all do the same things and we all come out with the same results. Resumes aren't quite like that. So depending on your particular background, some information may be on your resume that won't be on somebody else's and vice versa. But there are at least 7 different categories that you might choose among to include, and more than 7, but you should at least be able to name 7. You'll also be able to name 3 things that should not be on your resume. And we point these out because some of these things used to be standard on resumes and no longer are. And some of them are things that are standard in other countries that sometimes people have come here from. So they have a different notion of what goes into resumes. So I just want to clarify what does and does not go into a resume. We'll talk about different styles of resume with particular emphasis on one. And we'll also talk about different ways that you can save the resume, because you never know where you might be when you learn of a job opportunity. And we want you to be able to access your resume wherever you might be. Last but not least, we won't actually have you begin filling out the worksheet, but I'm going to present to you a worksheet. If you've never had a resume before and you're sort of puzzled about what is this thing and what would go in it, using this worksheet will help you gather the information that you'll need to put in the resume. And then if you need additional help beyond that, we can potentially help you in our resource center actually create it physically. All right. Anybody in our group know why you need a resume? And not just because we said so. If so, you can offer an answer in the chat. And I'll wait just a minute in case any of you have any thoughts on the subject. For some of you, this might be old territory, and for some of you, this may be very new. First step to an interview. Exactly. You nailed it, Brian. Thank you. Sometimes people say, well, I need a resume to get a job, which is true usually, but there's a middle step, and the middle step is the interview. So the resume comes first and it presents your qualifications. And then hopefully somebody reads the resume and says, we want to talk to this person. That's the goal, is to get in the door to have the conversation. Next week, we talk about that conversation. That's called the interview. So it is to get the employer's attention, to get them interested. There is a screening process that employers typically go through. And so jobs can see your work experience. Exactly true. That's part of how they decide whether or not you're a good candidate for them. If you have related experience or related skills, even if you've used the skills somewhere else, that's going to work in your favor. So that's what the resume presents. Hopefully, when they read your resume, they'll be interested in the cover letter that might go with it. It's going to present specifically the information that qualifies you for the job you're applying for. What that means is it's possible, if it happens that you're going to be applying for several different kinds of jobs, you might need several versions of your resume. I hope not. If you're applying for one primary kind of job, one basic resume is going to do the trick. You may need to tweak it a little, but it basically pulls together whatever pieces of your background demonstrate that you're a good fit for the job that you're applying for. Oh, for some reason, this is not advancing. There we go. Well, it seemed to want to skip a few slides. So let's talk about the reader of resumes, the employer. Generally speaking, this notion has sort of been out there in the universe that resume writers have been reading about and talking about for a while. Oftentimes, when an employer gets your resume, they don't sit back and read the whole thing top to bottom, word for word. Very often they have several hundred resumes applying for the same one job. And that particular company may have more than one job that they're trying to fill. So they're getting hundreds of resumes. Because of that, they don't spend lots of time reading each and every resume. They skim them. And they spend approximately 6 seconds initially with that yes, no, maybe decision. I think I like what I see. I'll come back, and this one I'll read in more detail later on. This one, I don't see anything that interests me. I toss it away. Maybe there's a maybe pile. And they basically sort and eliminate a whole bunch of people, and then they come back to a much smaller pile. So 6 seconds, that's all we have to make an impression and hopefully get them to take a closer look and then call you in for an interview. That 6 seconds is important to think about because it influences what we do on the resume, where we put certain information, and how we organize the resume. So I'll say a little more about that as we go along, and I will be showing you some examples. So what goes into a good resume? The first and probably most important thing is your resume has to be accurate, which means no typos, and it has to be honest, which means no lies. It's sort of obvious, and most of us know this. Sometimes people try to cut corners a little bit because maybe the job posting said they wanted a person who had a bachelor's degree and you only have an associate's degree. And sometimes people stretch the truth, shall we say. Please don't. It's immediate grounds for dismissal if you're caught. They absolutely will not hire you. And they do a background check, and they're gonna look at all those things. So that's really crucial. Accuracy, which is really more about typos, is really important. And sometimes people wonder, well, why should that matter? I'm not applying for a job typing. But it matters because it shows attention to detail. And I can't think of a single job I've ever heard of that does not require attention to detail. So even though you may never have to write a single thing in your job, they still want to know that you're paying attention and that you're going to make your document as accurate as possible, and you're going to do your job as accurately as possible. If you're not good with spelling and grammar, please get another pair of eyes, or maybe 2 other pairs of eyes, to read it for you and proofread it and make sure it's good. Even when you are really, really good, I'm very good with this stuff, but I'm human and I make mistakes. And when I'm reading something I've written, I read what I think is supposed to be there, not what's actually there. So please, please, please do yourself a favor and have somebody else read through it before you submit it. So that's rule number 1. Beyond that, keep it easy to read. Having white space on the page lets the words and the sentences breathe a little bit and helps the reader digest the information. Have you ever read, even a newspaper? A newspaper is packed with information, or a legal document, the terms of use for Facebook or some other account like that. And it's all really, really dense, almost solid black ink on the page. And most of us don't bother reading that stuff because it's too hard. Same thing with a resume. If you put too much information crammed into the page, it's off-putting. People are not going to want to read it. It's okay to spread out the information onto 2 pages if you have enough information to justify that. So use white space, keep it easy to read. So accuracy with spelling, grammar, word usage, sentence structure, all that. And then consistency. The appearance of the resume matters. So if you decide you're going to label different sections of your resume with all capital letters, perfectly fine. You don't have to, but you can. That's one of the many choices you get to make. But if that is the choice you make, then do that for every single heading. If you don't want to capitalize, but you want to bold, fine, bold everything in that category. So it helps both the human reader, and a little bit later on, we're going to mention, in addition to having humans read your resume, there's computer software that most employers are now using. And you also have to create the resume so that the computer software can find the right information. So everything I'm telling you here works for both humans and computers. Needs to have your basic contact information. And what we mean by that is your name. You don't need street address, but you need city, state, and zip, city or town, as the case may be. And then a phone number and an email address. Those are the minimum things that should be on the resume, as in terms of contacting, allowing employers to contact you. And then the whole rest of the page is your choice about which pieces of your background best qualify you for the job you're interested in. It might be, for example, the things you see on the screen. It could be a listing of your skills. It could be your work history. Maybe you've always done this work. Maybe there was a gap. We'll talk about gaps in a little bit. And you're going to go back to the same work you've always done. That's fine. Then it's work history that might be the best qualifier. Maybe you've never done the work you're looking to do now. This is a new career. Maybe we're going to focus on education or training because you have new skills that qualify you for the job. So whatever it is, you'll include that information, and you don't really need much more than that. So let's talk about other kinds of categories that could be on the resume depending on your background, and you can use the chat for that. Experience, absolutely. Education, sure. Everybody's got some education. Whenever it is you left school, whether you got degrees or diplomas or not, we've all been to school for some period of time, possibly certifications. Thank you. Yes. Skills, for sure. And I'm not saying you must have these. I'm saying you could have these. You probably, if you have work experience, you'll probably need to include that. If you have you do have education, that would probably be there. Skills often are there. They don't absolutely have to be there. And not everybody has certifications. So that wouldn't apply for everybody, but it applies for many. Skills, education, yep. And if you attended a training program to gain some skills, maybe that's included in your education section. You earned a certificate to in safe food handling, or a forklift license or something like that. All of those things. And your jobs and experience, yeah. They want to know where you've worked. And have you successfully held jobs? Absolutely. So all of those are absolutely correct. But there's more, potentially. Again, you don't have to include any of these. You might not even have many of these. But if you do, you could possibly include them if you think it will help to make the case that you're a good candidate for the job you're looking for. We'll talk about a summary section as one thing you could include. We mentioned skills and work history or experience and education. If you've served in the military in the US, that's something you could include. Don't have to, could. Licenses and certifications, honors and awards. In any of the jobs that you held, did you receive any honors or awards or special recognition? Were you employee of the month in the restaurant that you worked in, for example? Not all organizations give awards, but some do. And not everybody earns them when they work at these companies. If you did, that says to the next employer, you're a good employee. If you won an award, that's cool. Some people have publications or patents. Some people have volunteered in different kinds of settings. And that volunteer experience could be important to include. And many, many more kinds of categories that could be on the resume. If you think that there's something that you've done that would be of interest to the employer, we can probably figure out a way to include it on the resume. So we're going to work our way down the page. We're going to start with contact information, as you can see here on the resume. And as I said before, you don't need the full street address. You just can include city, state, zip, an email address. Make sure your email address has been created to look professional. Ideally, it will have your name at whatever email account you use. Lots of times people get very creative, and I've seen some delightful email addresses and some that are absolutely unacceptable for a professional situation. You could be a Red Sox fan, for example, and call yourself redsoxfan@gmail.com. There's nothing wrong with that, except it really doesn't present you the way an employer wants to see you. You can have the conversation about the Red Sox during the interview, or even somewhere else if you actually are actively involved with the Red Sox in some way. But usually first name, last name @Gmail. And if you have a common name, like the one on this resume, Scott Stevens, I'll bet there are dozens of those. Maybe you have something else, Scott Stevens, 27, because your birthday is on the 27th or something. You could do that @gmail.com, or Scott Stevens zip code @Gmail. Don't use your year of birth. Sometimes people do that. Scott Stevens, 1983. And now I can do the math. When I see a number that looks like it's a date, a year, I find myself calculating, all right, 83, that was 17 until you get to 2000 plus 22. So that person's 39. I immediately start to do that. We don't need to have people guessing your age or calculating your age. It's irrelevant. It should be irrelevant. Email address and a phone number. If you happen to be on LinkedIn, some of our clients are, you would include your LinkedIn URL if you have one. That's not essential. Underneath your contact information, you might have a summary. Again, it's not required. It's something that many people choose to do because it gives the reader, in 2 or 3 sentences, a summary of who you are and what qualifies you for the job you're applying for. Once upon a time, for those in the group today who might be older, resumes had an objective, and the objective typically read something like seeking position as whatever, where I can learn new skills and advance my career. That's exactly not what we do now, because that statement is all about me. The resume is all about the employer, strangely enough. It's all about me insofar as I can help the employer. So I might be seeking whatever that position is. And even though I do want to grow my skills and advance my career, I want to talk about the skills that I have that can help the employer. So that's the value that I offer. So so I can improve my teaching skills, instead it's where I can use my presentation skills to provide information to your clients. You always frame it in terms of how my skills can help you, the employer. If you are changing careers, the summary concept doesn't quite work, because if we're summarizing what you used to do, it doesn't really qualify you necessarily for what you want to do next. So you could say target, whatever the new title is, and then you'll talk about what pieces of your background do qualify you. It might not be your work experience, but you might have skills that you used in the other job that carry over into the new job. So here's an example of a summary, and I'm going to show you this on an actual resume in a few minutes. So this is a bilingual, and I specify what the languages are, English, Spanish, crew member with experience in fast-paced environment, recognized for excellent customer service with multiple Employee of the Month awards. Told you we could get it in there if you have them. Able to handle all food prep equipment, cash registers, and point of sale databases, ServSafe certified, ChokeSaver training. A lot of the words in that last two sentences are likely to be words that you found in the job posting. We call them keywords, and they're skills or knowledge that hopefully the candidate possesses that qualify you for the job. If I applied for this job and I don't have food prep equipment experience, I'm not going to be considered for the job. So if I do have that experience, I want to tell them that up front right away. Because if you go back to the 6 seconds information that I mentioned earlier, how do we read? We read from the top of the page down. So we want to put the best information, the strongest information that qualifies you, as close to the top of the page as we can. So the reader right away sees what they're looking for, and they put you in the yes pile without even reading the whole document, maybe. That would be cool. And for example, I've never used a point of sale database. So if I'm applying for a job that requires that skill, I'm not going to be a good candidate. It's not on my resume anyplace. If I do have that skill, I want to make sure they can see it right off the bat. After that, you get to decide what information is going to be most impressive to the reader. What order do you want to put things in? And the answer is it depends. Typically, people start with a summary. They might very well have skills next, work history, education. But sometimes if you're changing field and you do have a new certification, for example, I would put education higher up, because that's what qualifies you for the job you want next. Your work history is irrelevant, or not totally irrelevant, but it's a whole lot less meaningful to the reader. Some people don't have a skills section. They just go right in and start talking about their education, or they talk about their work history. It's a judgment call. As I said, it's not a recipe or a formula where we all do everything exactly the same way. You decide, you know your background, what pieces of your background are likely to be of the greatest interest to the employer, because they match the job based on the job posting. And it's simple to talk about. Sometimes it's a little harder to make the decisions when you actually look at your own background. So here's something you could do with skills. You could simply list them in a couple of columns like this with bullet points in front of them. Here's somebody who has customer service, Microsoft Office, etc. You can see, and that comes right after the summary on this person's resume. I'm going to show you the resume that I pulled this from. And again, the reader, 6 seconds, I see these things, and I'm looking for somebody for my store, and I'm seeing, oh, good, customer service, oh, I'm sorry, for my restaurant, food safety, cash handling, attention to detail. Those are all the things I need this person to have. I see them, good. I'm going to read in more detail later. Maybe I won't even read. Maybe I know right away. I like this person. I want to talk to them. And then we'll talk about the experience section. I'm talking about them in this order because this is a common order, but not because it's the correct order for everybody. With experience, so this is your work experience, and we're going to have you list work experience in reverse chronological order. In other words, start with your most recent work and work backwards. Information that you want to include will be the name of your employer, where the employer was located, city and state. You don't need full street address, your job title, and the dates that you worked there. Then you can actually present several different statements about what you did on your job, the tasks you performed, skills that you used, and any specific results that you achieved. You can also include any volunteer work that you may have done. So paid work is terrific, of course, and most of us would like to be paid for what we do, but sometimes there are situations where we just do something because we care about a cause, or we're helping family. Maybe some people have provided childcare for family members, and not even for pay, just because you could do it. That's fine. That can be included because you use skills when you're doing that. Whatever you do that demonstrates skills that you have can be included. It's a judgment call. Okay, so this is on this particular document where this appears. In this case, we have qualifications rather than skills above it. It doesn't matter. You can call it either one. And then work experience. You can call it work experience. You can call it work history. Doesn't matter. And then you list your work history. Let me take a minute now. Hang on a second. No, I added this slide today, so let me speak to this, and then I'm going to show you a couple of resumes that are set up in two different ways. I want to talk about the gap. So I'm telling you that resumes are most effective when they are in reverse chronological order. That's the primary format that employers like to see. There are a couple of other formats that sometimes people use, particularly if there's a gap or some other unusual circumstance in somebody's background. However, the preferred format for employers is a chronological resume. And if you're dealing with computer software that might be processing your resume, the chronological resume is the only one that will work. That said, what if there's a gap in your background? A few years that you were not working in the workforce. It happens for many, many different reasons. People leave their jobs to take care of kids, or to take care of family members, or for incarceration, or because they have medical issues. Many, many different reasons that account for the time. But what do you put on the resume? Employers prefer not to see gaps, particularly if they're recent gaps and if they're long gaps. 6 months or more starts to look like a long gap to them. So let me show you now a couple of variations of resumes. Go back to the top. So actually, let me show you this whole handout. You'll be getting this. And since we're recording this, anybody who is listening, this will be attached or available with the recording, so you'll be able to download these handouts. I'm going to be talking in a couple of minutes about the actual statements on your resume, and we want you to use strong action words, action verbs, and there are a whole bunch of them here. And here's a worksheet that you can use if you haven't had a resume before. You can start to fill in your name and address, or email address, I should say, and information for your summary. And then scrolling down, we have several groups of lines for you to fill in different work experiences that you might have had. So, and skills and things like that, and education. So you can go through that and fill it out. And here is a second page. And again, here are other headings that might be helpful for you. Maybe you've belonged to some organizations of some sort in the community, in your professional field, whatever it may be, and you could list those as well, among many other things. Let me show you 3 different chronological resumes. So when I showed you the summary before, that was the summary that's on this resume. So this individual worked in a restaurant, in a couple of different restaurants. He was a crew member and he was part of the counter staff. Now, in this case, he had a pretty straightforward work history, 2012 to 14, 2014 to 2017. What's he been doing for the last 5 years? We don't know. That's one of those things that can be a red flag for employers if they don't know what's going on and they're kind of worried about that. So there are a couple of different things we can do to make it less obvious. If this person's dates were consecutive with no gap, I would set it up exactly this way. Since there is a gap, I wouldn't make the dates, I wouldn't put the dates over here on the right, because look how much white space there is around them. The eye just goes right over there to see what information that is, because it's so easy to read it. And then you read down and you see, okay, so he was there for 3 years, he was in the other job for 2 years, but what's he been doing since 2017? We don't know. He's got great information if you're hiring somebody for your restaurant, but a little bit of a red flag. They may or may not call him in. And here he's got certifications. He actually could lead with his certifications because those are really impressive and they're important in the restaurant world. It's a judgment call. Here's somebody else, and this is where the skills section that I showed you before in the PowerPoint came from. So we've got her summary, we've got skills, and then we've got her work history. But look what I did with the dates here. And this person has a gap also, but her gap is earlier. Her last job ended just a few months ago in November. No worries there. I actually should have done these the other way around. I just realized this is a last minute change that I made. But you can see how much less obvious the dates are here. You kind of have to look for them. And there is a gap in her resume. So she worked from 2015 to 2019, and the job before that was 2008 to 2009. There's a 6-year gap there. It's not as obvious because we moved the dates over, and because the gap is as old as it is. I mean, that's trying to do the math here. What, more than 10 years old? Employers aren't going to be concerned about a gap that long ago. She's got solid work experience, 7 consecutive years, hardly interrupted at all. No concerns there. But just to show you, there are different things you can be doing with just how you put the information on the page to direct the reader to the information you want them to see. So as I said, I set up the dates probably the opposite of the way I wanted them. I'm going to fix that and send it to you the correct way so that what you'll see is these dates will be off to the right, because these are perfectly, what do I want to say? They're dates that are not going to raise any red flags. No employer is going to be concerned that this person's been out of the workforce for too long. Whereas on the earlier version, the Guillermo's resume, those dates jump off the page and they're kind of problematic, potentially. They just raise questions we don't need to call attention. I did something different with Jasmine's resume. I have 2 versions of her same resume. So here's one where the skills are just listed. And I decided to show you a second version. Same information. The information is exactly the same. But what I did was I set up the skills differently, and I gave an example because I thought, so she's got, oh, this version, did I not change the dates on this? I think I didn't. So here we have a gap of 2 years. She hasn't worked since 2019. Again, don't know why that is. There are many explanations that are possible. We don't want that to be the first thing the employer sees and thinks about and worries about. We want to convince the employer in that quick 6 seconds, top of the page, that she's got exactly what the employer is looking for the job she's applying for. So I took the same skills and I gave an example, and I just pulled the example from her work history. I'm saying in the previous resume, I say she has interpersonal skills, but until you actually read the resume, you don't know what that means. So here I say, here's the skill and here's an example. Here's another skill, here's an example. And it's pretty much the statements that are below, but I changed the wording a little bit. And then I get to the work history. So the reader hopefully is already impressed and is thinking, this person has exactly the skills I'm looking for. Terrific. And then, oh, there's, a question, but I really like what I'm seeing. Let me call them in and talk, because that's the goal. Let's get the interview. And all the rest of it is the same. So that's that handout. Let me go back to the PowerPoint. So those are a couple of different things to do if there is a gap in your background. And another thing you can do is, if you actually did do some work, or that might be where sometimes volunteer experience kicks in. If you're home raising kids, sometimes people are active in the community. If you're incarcerated, sometimes you hold a job in the institution that you were in which case you can list that. It's a legitimate job. You wouldn't list the name of the place that you were in, but you would say you worked for the county of, or the state or commonwealth of, depending on the institution that you were in, and the job title. And then you would set it up the same way you would any other job. So there are any number of things you can do. And if during your gap period, whatever the reason for the gap, I said you might have been volunteering, you also might have been taking some kind of courses or training of some sort. If you did anything to gain new skills during that gap period, that's something you can speak to. In fact, you can even mention, while out of the workforce, pursued a certificate in, or whatever it is you did that advanced your skills. That kind of industriousness, commitment to improving yourself impresses employers and everybody for that matter. So that's another thing you can do with that gap. When you're actually writing about the things you did in your jobs, I briefly showed you the list of action verbs in the handout. The strongest statements are ones that begin with a verb. Those are the action words in our sentences. Here is what I did. I presented a webinar. I supervised a team. I drove a truck. I handled the cash transactions in the store. Those verbs are what you want to use. Now, I always point out when I do this topic that this image is not meant, this is not where you should go for your verb examples. This is really kind of funny when you think about resumes, because I cannot think of any situation. There are a couple of words in here, like misplace. It's an action verb. We have probably all misplaced things from time to time. It's probably not something you want on your resume unless you found something that somebody else misplaced. So, beg, not a verb I'd put on a resume. So there are a lot of things here. These are all verbs. They're all actions, but they're not all necessarily appropriate verbs for your resume. Use the handout that I'm going to provide to you and just laugh at some of these others, because really, when would you honk? Not usually a work skill that you need to call attention to. If you're currently working, your resume will use the present tense. So I present webinars because I do it on an ongoing basis right now, currently. If my job is over and I want to talk about something I did in my previous job, I would say presented webinars, past tense. And add the skills. So it's not enough to say that you presented webinars using Zoom technology, and I would actually say presented PowerPoint webinars or designed and delivered PowerPoint webinars using Zoom to audiences up to however many people. So include accomplishments, outcomes when you have them. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't, depending on the kind of work that you did. So a couple of examples. Sometimes people just write down a phrase, food service. Okay, I know now that you had something to do with food service, but I don't really know exactly what you did. So you can improve that, serve meals to people. Okay, it's better. Now I understand what your role was. How busy were you? How many people did you serve? So you can elaborate on that. You can say more. Serve meals to 250 people a day. I made up that number. I don't know. Is that a reasonable number if you're in the food service world? 250 people per day during the busy lunch hour. Okay, I'm impressed because my restaurant serves 100 people. So you'd be a good candidate because clearly you can handle even more than what my store, my restaurant needs. So anytime you can give more detail, it works to your advantage. Unless, of course, the opposite is true. You really only serve 2 people on any given day. I'm picking extremes, of course, and 2 is not really very impressive. And what were you doing with the rest of your time? So obviously use numbers if they help your case, basically. If they show that you're really good at what you do, you're really efficient, you're fast, you can get a lot done, that can be helpful. So now let's look at the education section, because employers typically want to know, how far along did you get in your schooling? Most of the time, I shouldn't say most of the time, where you put it on the page will depend on a couple of things: how recent your education is, how closely your education matches the requirements. Sometimes it's less important for some jobs than for other jobs. Some jobs, it's a must-have. You must have a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering or whatever it may be. Must have a particular credential. If there's a must-have in the job posting and you have it, I would put that as close to the top as I can. It might mean putting the whole section up at the top, which is okay. Or it might mean mentioning the skill in the summary, or whatever makes sense. Again, specific courses, specific training that you took, whether or not you received any kind of credential doesn't matter necessarily. I would, for example, if I were creating my resume right now, I might include some webinars that I've attended to keep my skills up to date. I'm constantly on the lookout for updated information about how employers are reading resumes nowadays. I found something this morning on cover letters and spent 15 minutes listening to that. Well, I now have new information that I didn't have yesterday. That sort of thing could go on a resume if I didn't have other stuff, especially. And even if I do, just to say, hey, I'm up to date. I know the latest information about cover letter strategy. What be different from what I knew 5 years ago. So even if it wasn't part of a formal program, I stumbled upon it when I was on LinkedIn today, and it was interesting and informative. I could include it. There really are no or very few boundaries around what could be on your resume. And then we talked about those basic sections. There are many, many other sections: volunteer experience, licenses. You could include license in the summary. You could include it as its own section. You could do both. Honors and awards, I mentioned, publications, whatever there may be. Professional affiliations. Did you belong to any a union? Did you belong to a professional association? I belong to some resume writer and career coach associations. Those would be on my resume. So many possibilities, and no have-tos. Now, here are some things that do not need to be on your resume. You can see on the right, there's a checklist in green. Here are things that should be there, but a whole bunch of things that don't need to be on your resume. And this is important because, as I said before, some of the customs in our country have changed, and anybody who might be new to the United States and might have learned about resumes in some other country, every country does it differently. And some countries require a photo, for example. We don't. In fact, with very few exceptions, a photo is frowned upon. We discourage that because we attempt to keep the hiring process as bias-free as possible. We don't want to see what you look like unless it's a modeling job or something like that. That's different because your appearance is why you're being hired. But for most other jobs, that's not important. Same thing with certain personal information, date of birth, marital status, family information. Doesn't need to be there. I've seen resumes from some European countries that say married with 2 children. We don't do that here. We used to. That's one of the things that's changed here. Another thing that's changed in this country is we used to say at the bottom of every single resume, references available upon request. Not anymore. And the reason we no longer say it is because most people can provide references. It doesn't in any way distinguish you from anybody else. So employers themselves realized if we want references, we'll ask. And it's more important that you use that space to tell us something else about yourself that will make us want to talk to you. I'm not going to invite you in for an interview because you tell me you have references. I will invite you in for an interview if you tell me you have a particular skill that I need. So we get rid of that. And sometimes people decide they're going to be a little bit too casual with resumes, and they use there's a font called Comic Sans that almost looks like the writing you see in a cartoon or in a comic strip, or script font. Let me make it formal and elegant, like an invitation. Save those fonts for your invitations. Don't use them in resumes. They're hard to read and hard for computers to scan if the computer software is processing your resume. You can include a LinkedIn URL. That would be your LinkedIn address that you use to search for your profile. You don't need to include Facebook or Instagram or any other social media accounts unless your job is social media. You're the person who creates social media posts for a particular employer, then you can throw it all on the page to demonstrate your experience with it. But for the rest of us, that stuff doesn't need to be there. And again, salary information, not important. Also not important, why you are no longer in your last job. They may ask you in an interview, which is fine, they often do, but it doesn't belong on the resume. So formatting options, I mentioned reverse chronological order. You start with your most recent job, work backwards, and this is what will work with the computer systems. They're called applicant tracking systems, or ATS for short. There are a couple of other formats. There's a format called a functional resume, and that focuses on skills. So in the same way that before I listed some skills on that resume, it sort of does that, but it doesn't say very much about where you use them. The resume I showed you, let me go back to it for a second. Here, this version. You can see we're putting a lot of emphasis on skills, but the work history is still the same work history that was on the basic chronological resume. With a functional resume, you'd mostly have those skills, and then you would list the employer and the title and the dates and nothing else. And so the reader would be left saying, all right, you assisted 200 customers, where, when? Is that something you did 15 years ago and maybe now you don't have the same stamina? They don't know. Where here you can see, all right, you did it as recently as 4 years ago, you're probably, or 3 years ago, you're probably still good to go. But if it was 15 years ago, maybe you can't keep up at that pace. So they prefer this version, but the functional would have skills like that, just without the all of the detail here. And this is sort of more of a combination resume. That's the third kind, and I probably should relabel it. It's the bottom part is chronological and the top part is skills in detail. Back to PowerPoint. So how do you put the information together? It's okay to have a 2-page resume if you have a longer career. Generally, more than 2 pages is too much. There are some rare exceptions. I always tell people who attend our resume workshops, if you have specific questions about your circumstances, always come talk to a career coach somewhere. Certainly come to us at MassHire downtown Boston and schedule an appointment. We can sit down and talk you through your own particular circumstances. Text is going to be, you'll start in the left-hand margin and work to the right. Your section headings can be on the left or they can be centered, whatever you think looks attractive. Some of the fonts that you might use are shown on the screen here. Arial, Calibri, Verdana, Tahoma are common ones that are easy to read on a screen, because many of the readers are reading resumes directly on the computer or on their phone. Sometimes they're not even reading them on a big computer screen. They're actually using their cell phone or an iPad. Hard to read. They're pretty small. So that's another reason the top part matters. 10 to 12 point font size, and keep the margins wide enough so that you don't get tempted to put too much information on one page. Sometimes people use templates of different sorts, or there are all kinds of programs online. If you search for the phrase resume builder, you'll find lots of sites that let you plug the information in and they will create a resume for you. And they'll show you different designs and you can pick the design you like. I'm telling you this not to encourage you to go find these. I'm trying actually to do the opposite, because even if you have an attractive resume, sometimes you need to make some changes to it. And it's very hard to edit, number one. Number two, very often they are designed in a way that makes it hard for applicant tracking systems, that's the computer software, to read them. They can't find the information that's on the page just because of technology. Technology can't read past the design. Sometimes people, either through these different templates or resume builders, or they happen to have really good skills themselves with Microsoft Word, and they create these beautiful designs using columns and all sorts of things. Those things don't work. Keep it simple. You don't have to have the fanciest resume. You just have to have good information that shows that you can do this job. Once you've got all the information together and you've organized it, you need to save your document. And we recommend that you save it with your own name and maybe the job title that you're applying for. Sometimes, when we're typing our own documents on our own computer, and it's our computer, you just, what's this document? It's resume. So you say resume. Well, if they get 100 applications and everybody names their resume, that's not going to help them very much. They may like your resume. They need a way to be able to find it. So put your name on it, maybe the title that you're applying for. That way, when they see the file, they'll know, okay, right now I'm interested in the food service job. That's the job I'm trying to fill. Later on, I'll fill the manager job, but right now I'm trying to fill this job, so I'm looking for all of those resumes. So that's a courtesy to them. And it also makes it easier for you, particularly if you are applying to more than one kind of job, because then you might have different versions of your resume, because different pieces of your background might be more important for one job than for a different job. And then once you've saved it, you can save it several different ways and on several different devices. The format that we most recommend is that you save it as a Word document. It's going to have a .doc or .docx extension after the name. That format is universally read by applicant tracking systems. Now, some of you know that you can save a document as a PDF. I forget what that stands for, but it's anyway, something format, which keeps the formatting locked in place. And many job postings will tell you you can submit a PDF. And if you can and want to, that's okay. If they don't specify, I would avoid the PDF. The nice thing about the PDF is the information stays exactly the way you put it. With the Word document, somebody else opens that document on their computer. The information sometimes shifts, moves around a little bit. Once you've saved it, we recommend that you do a couple of different things. Send it to yourself as an email attachment, as a Word doc. That way, if you're off visiting somebody and you get a notification, maybe you posted your resume on Indeed and you've set up job alerts, and Indeed tells you there's a job, and you read it, you think, that's it, I'm really excited. You want to apply for it right away. Generally speaking, you don't want to wait very long. There are some organizations that program their computer systems to stop accepting applications once they've received a certain number. So you want to respond as quickly as you can. Doesn't hurt to always have access to your resume while you're looking for a job, while you're out and about. Another thing you can do is save it on a flash drive. You can see a bunch of colorful flash drives on the screen. That way, again, you have a backup. Save it on your computer. We know that technology can fail. Your computer can crash. Mine did in December, and you lose everything you had. That's not fun. You don't want to have to recreate things. It's good to have them in several different places, and then you can access them. One thing that can be a little bit problematic is to save it as a Google Doc, because many applicant tracking systems cannot read Google Docs. I don't know enough about technology to know why that is. I just know that it is. And so Google Docs can be useful if you're working on it and you're trying to get opinions from other people, and several people can be working on it at the same time, but probably not the preferred format. If you want more information about resume writing, this is a link you can check out. That's pretty much our content. Let me review some of the main points. The reason you need a resume is to get in the door for a conversation. We call that an interview. To get that interview, you want to include the pieces of your background that best qualify you for the job. Usually, you will include skills. Possibly, that's not an always thing, but very often. Work history, almost always, if you have some work history. Education, for certain. Maybe you have a license or certification, and it's relevant for the work that you're looking to do. If it's not relevant, it's an old certification you happen to still have. You don't need to take up space with it if it's not going to help to convince the employer to bring you in for an interview. You can include volunteer experience. You can include information that you are participating in community activities, military history, if it's in the US, publications, so many additional things. Any current or recent training, courses, programs, whether or not they led to a certification or a license. It shows you're committed to learning and improving yourself, and that you have the latest information in your field. Things not to include: a photo, birth date, social security number, and so much more. You can go back to that slide if you're not sure. Chronological resume is really a reverse chronological resume. Start with the present and work backwards. And then save your resume in several different formats on several different devices so that you don't have the very frustrating experience of losing a file, and so that you can access it whenever you might need it, because you never know when an opportunity might present itself. For more information about us, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. We're on Instagram too. You can also come to our website, MassHire Downtown Boston, and find out what's going on, what other activities. As Susan mentioned earlier, there will be a follow-up to this next week on interviewing. We're assuming you're going to have this great resume. You will get interviews. And then there are questions you may have that I hope I can address, and we'll do that. You'll be ready for an interview, and then there will be the community fair later on. So many activities for you to follow up with. Let me pause before I end this and see if you have any specific questions about anything I haven't covered, or clarification on anything that I have. Excellent. Thank you, Brian. You're welcome, Edwin. I always pause for a few minutes because some people type slowly. So just in case there are any more questions coming in. Where can I download handouts for the resume? I will be emailing them to you. Because you signed in through Zoom, you needed to provide your email address, so I'll be able to get that in just a few minutes, actually, when the webinar is over. I will get those, and I will be emailing those to you directly. All right, I'm thinking that may be it as far as questions. So thank you for coming, and good luck with your resumes. And perhaps I'll see some of you next week, I believe, same time, same place. And we'll talk about interviewing and how to handle some tricky questions and how to ace the interview, as they say. Are we using those resumes for something, or is for us to just keep? Whatever resume you create will be for you to use for your own job search. If you want feedback on them, if you're a MassHire member, you can schedule a one-on-one appointment with one of the career navigators, and we can go over your resume with you and give you some feedback and suggestions. If you need help actually creating it, you can use our computer lab. And if you don't have computer skills, they can help you with that part of it as well. Or even if you just don't know, or you just have questions about it, that's another resource for you. All right, so thank you again, everybody. Good luck, and hope to see some of you next week. All righty. Good night, have a good evening.